So we are talking with Sean Cudden in Scotland, and I wanted to talk to him again just to get your thoughts, Sean, on the recent elections there in UK.
Yeah. Okay. Do you have any specific areas you want to discuss?
Well, just let's first start, go over the outcome a little bit, just in general.
Okay. Well, there were essentially three sets of elections. So there was the English council elections. So that's the local authorities in England that deal with basic local services. There was the election to the Scottish Parliament, and there was the election to the Welsh Senate, which is the Welsh Parliament. And so going into this election, you've got the Labour Party as the UK government. They were the dominant party in the Welsh Parliament, and they were also the dominant party in the English council areas. Um, so if we start with the English council areas,
So just
um,
to go
yeah,
back to the Welsh Parliament, is that the Wales like Independence Party?
it's called Plaid Cymru, and their position has changed recently. They used to be quite comfortable with the idea of Wales being part of the UK, but also having a degree of autonomy. They have moved towards being for independence. I think at the moment they're still on the fence about it, but they're moving in that direction.
Okay. So sorry, go ahead with what you were saying.
So in the English council elections, um, Labour were the dominant party in England um, at that level of government, but it was very obvious for the last few months that they were going to have a very, very tough time in those elections. And it was for a long time, it looked like Reform UK, where a right wing, a new right wing party, were going to be their main challenger. More recently, the Green Party has been surging in the polls, and it was a bad night for Labour because they lost to both Reform and the Greens, depending on which part of the country you were in. Reform did very well in some parts, Green did well in other parts. But Reform really, it was their night, really. I know a lot of people on the left in the UK have been trying to kind of downplay it and maybe pretended to themselves a little bit that it wasn't that bad, but Reform did very, very well. Um, they they picked up well over 1,400 council seats, um, which was the most on the night. I mean, I think the next biggest, no, in fact, yeah, it was the most on the night. The next biggest was the Conservatives. Um, Sorry, that's not true. It was the Greens. The next biggest was the Greens. They won 441 new seats, which brought them up to a total of 587. 588. Let me just check my notes. Yeah, 587. Um, so Reform on the night won more than three times as many seats as the Greens. And those really were the only two parties that did well. The Liberal Democrats picked up a few, but not many. Um, so there's a split there between this insurgent right wing party and an insurgent left wing party, and Labour have got caught in the middle. With they're the only party really that's losing votes to both the right and the left. The Conservatives lost a lot to Reform, but they didn't really lose much to the Greens, whereas the Labour Party are being pulled in both directions. Um, so that was England. In Scotland, the Scottish Parliament election happened, and as all the polls predicted, the Scottish National Party won very, very comfortably. Um, but Labour and Reform were tied in second place, a very, very distant second, but Reform are a new party. They've only existed for 4 years, and for a long time, it looked like Scotland was immune to reform. They weren't getting anywhere in Scotland at all. No one was interested in them. And then suddenly, over the last maybe 3 or 4 months, they just surged in the polls in Scotland. It looked like they might even finish second at one point, but well, they have finished second, but they've finished tied second with Labour. And then there's Wales, and Wales is the real story of the election because Labour have won every election in Wales since 1922. They've won every Welsh Parliament election since it was established 27 years ago, and Reform and the Welsh nationalists, Plaid Cymru, destroyed Labour in Wales. Labour ended up with 9 seats in the Welsh Parliament. So they went from being the Welsh government to having just 9 seats, and that was in an expanded parliament. I can't remember how many seats there are in the Welsh Parliament, but it went from roughly 50 to about 70 seats. And even though there were more seats, Labour ended up with just 9. The Welsh Nationalists won, and Reform came a fairly close second to them with about 29% of the vote, which, I mean, that if Labour has a heartland, it's Wales, and their vote just was destroyed in Wales, and it's a seismic event really in British politics for Labour to lose Wales.
Okay. Um, so I have a couple of questions. Maybe you'd like to um, just give your analysis first in general of why these things, these elections developed the way they did.
Well, immigration's been a huge issue in Britain over the last 10 to 15 years, and none of the mainstream parties have really been able to handle it. So what's happened is these two emergent parties have come along. The Greens are very pro-migration and very pro-immigrant. Reform are very anti-migration. And so on that issue, that you have these two polar opposites. As well as that, there's just a sort of general distrust of the mainstream parties. That's been growing for a long time. It's especially true of the Labour Party because I think a lot of people put their faith in Labour in 2024, hoping that Labour would undo some of the damage that the Conservatives had done for the previous 14 years. But Labour have just they've just carried on business as usual, pretty much the same kind of policies that the Conservatives had. Maybe not quite as mean spirited as the Conservatives, but well, on some things anyway. But they haven't really tried to change anything. And the Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, is he's a very poor politician. He doesn't really seem to understand how to connect with his own base, never mind a wider electorate. So Labour they had a landslide victory in the general election 2024, and since then they've just been hemorrhaging support. And Starmer hasn't been able to turn it around. He doesn't seem to have any idea how to turn it around, and there's a fairly good chance he won't be prime minister for much longer.
So, you know, in the United States, the issue of immigration was a huge issue. Although even in the last election, it was an issue. But the issue that really pushed Trump over the top was economics, the inflation, and what they're now calling affordability.
Yeah.
So, and as I understand it, Labor has, or under Starmer, has followed the same old, basically neoliberal policies
Yeah.
of cutbacks in social programs and so on.
Yeah.
So my question is, to what extent did that issue and the issue of economics in general how did that balance out with the issue of immigration per se?
Well, the survey data in the run up to the election showed that the main three issues were education, health, and immigration was third. But immigration, the reason I mentioned immigration is that that's reform's big thing, and that's where they seem to be getting their support. But more broadly, I think there's a feeling that Labour were given an opportunity to change things and didn't, and that's probably why the Greens are doing well because people have become so disillusioned with Labour that they're looking for an alternative. In Scotland and Wales, there are the nationalist parties there that can do that, and the Greens didn't do all that well. They did quite well in Scotland, but they didn't do particularly well in Wales because people had that alternative. In England, the alternative seems to be the Greens. Um, the economy hasn't been doing particularly well. It hasn't been doing disastrously badly either, but it isn't doing very well. And I think that issue probably is in the background. It's not. It's maybe not. As I said, it isn't one of the three main things that people were talking about as issues. But the UK has had what we've been calling austerity since 2010. So welfare and education and health, all of those budgets have always been under the microscope since the financial crash. Um, and they're still under the microscope. And there was a brief moment, bizarrely under Boris Johnson, when he kind of loosened the purse strings a little and around about 2019.
You listen to who?
That was when Boris Johnson was Prime Minister,
Yeah.
the Conservative Prime Minister, but he was taking a kind of a populist approach. Um, and I guess that was kind of messed up when COVID hit and he had to tighten things up again. But since then, we've had, let me think, two Conservative Prime Ministers and a Labour Prime Minister, and they've very much gone by the old playbook of David Cameron and Theresa May, cut budgets, tighten up spending, and of course give rich people tax cuts. So yeah, I think there's a desperation on the left for a party that will do something different and start spending money on people who need it to be spent rather than just continuing to cut budgets and give billionaires tax cuts. And that, I guess that's where the Green Party come in, and that's where a lot of their support is coming from. But
So,
also, there is a feeling that healthcare and education have been badly managed by Labour, but also by the Conservatives before them.
so would it be fair to say that those who in the past might have been inclined to vote for Labor, who were concerned mainly about, the social programs, healthcare, and so on, if that was their main concern, they would have been now inclined to move to the Greens. And those
Um,
whose main concern was immigration would have moved to reform. Is that, would you agree with
I think
that?
it's more complicated than that because what you've seen really in these elections is a shift from Labour to Reform. So from a left-leaning party to what is pretty much a far-right party. Whereas the Green vote, some of that has come from Labour, but this is what I was saying earlier, that Labour is being pulled in both directions, so that a lot of their white working class vote seems to be going to Reform, and a lot of the sort of graduate middle class vote seems to be leaving them to go to the Greens. So Labour are losing in both directions, whereas the Conservatives, who also had a bad night, they're losing support pretty much just to Reform. So that's why Labour are in such a bad position because they have two fights. They're trying to fight on two fronts now: the Greens to the left and Reform to the right. It's a very tricky situation for Labour.
So are you saying then that the Greens don't have very much working class support at this point?
No, they don't seem to. Not among white working class people anyway. Some of the places they've picked up support are constituencies where there's a large immigrant population, who are, for the most part, working class. So they do have some support among the working class, but among the organised working class too, trade unionists, some of them are switching to Labour, to the Greens. But the bulk of the switch from Labour to other parties was working class white voters voting for reform. Um, I don't think that's necessarily a permanent thing. In the 2019 general election, a large part of the north of England switched from Labour to the Conservatives, and many of those constituencies had been Labour for generations. And then they switched back in 2024. So I think it's more about a desperation that nothing's changing, nothing's being done to help these communities, and Labour doesn't seem to understand these communities anymore. So they're casting around for an alternative. Unfortunately, the alternative they've chosen this time, Reform, are very much against the sort of things that working class people need. So, for example, uh, several senior people in Reform, including Nigel Farage, have made statements about the possibility of privatising healthcare. Farage has even, I think, on one occasion mentioned the American system as a possible alternative, which would be devastating for most working class people.
So if they move in that, well, can that be done at the local level at all?
No, I think a lot
Really,
of this was really a
coming
kind
out of
of
these
protest.
elections, they can't really do that.
Sorry?
I say coming out of these elections where they've taken power at the local council level in some cases, they can't really move to privatize.
No, no, that would be a national level decision. I think a lot of this is a protest vote, and we'll see how Reform managed to hold on to those votes or not. But no, for now, the NHS is safe. But social care is something that's managed by local authorities. So retirement homes and things like that. A lot of that is managed by local authorities, which is worrying because I don't think Reform are particularly interested in that either.
But I mean, on the other side, you were saying that or this is what I interpreted you were to be saying, is that the main vote for reform came out of, you know, concern like the whole immigration issue. So, but when you were now you're saying, there was a feeling that nothing's being done in like in Wales and so on.
Yeah.
So, which is a little bit of
Well,
a different question, it seems to me.
it's a bit of both. A lot of the areas that have heavily voted for Reform are areas that supported Brexit, and have built up a reputation of being anti-immigration. But the immigration issue is tied in with lots of other things. So it's tied into things like housing, for example, and also healthcare. So Reform have been very good at whenever there's, for example, a housing shortage or waiting lists for services on through the National Health Service. They're very good at pointing out that in their view there's a connection with immigration. So the reason you can't get a house is, or the reason rent is going up is immigration. The reason that you're having to wait a long time for an operation is there's lots of immigrants in your area, and that's why you're on a long waiting list instead of just getting the healthcare that you need. So they've tied everything into immigration, and the other parties, the mainstream parties and the parties on the left, unfortunately, haven't been very good at countering those kind of arguments.
Haven't been very good at what?
They haven't. The other parties haven't been good at countering those arguments of coming up with a different position that people accept. So at the moment, Reform's argument is the one that people are hearing. They're not hearing other people make an alternative case.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, it strikes me on that, well, I always thought during the whole Brexit campaign that Corbyn really had a very weak argument because the only real answer on that issue was, well, we have to build an EU-wide movement for higher wages and so on, and we can't. It's far more difficult to do that if we're out of the EU. But he never raised that.
Mm.
So on the issue of immigration, again, it seems to me that the only way to counter that from a working class perspective is to say, well, we need a workers' movement so that people aren't being driven out of the countries in which they live, whether it's Syria or Poland.
Yeah. Um, I think part of the problem that I've noticed is that the left in the UK isn't very focused on class at all. It's very much focused on identity. So
That's like the US.
yeah,
Uh-huh.
so, actually I saw an interview just recently. It's a guy called Peter Mertens, who's one of the leaders of the Belgian Workers' Party, and he was saying that his party is overtly Marxist.
Which party?
The Belgian Workers' Party,
Benton.
Belgian,
Oh, Belgian Workers'
Belgium,
Party. Uh-huh.
yeah. So he was saying that his party is overtly Marxist and they're very focused on class politics. And I compare that to I used to be in a party called the Socialist Workers' Party, and I saw an advert the other day. The Socialist Workers' Party has a bookshop called Bookmarks, and they had in the advert there's a sign outside the shop, and it has a list on the sign of all the interesting topics that you can get books on in their independent bookshop, and it's feminism, environmentalism, LGBTQ plus, blah blah. So there's a whole list of things, and right at the bottom, the very last line it says Marxism, as if they're trying to hide it. And to me, that says something about the British left. It's like here's these Belgian Marxists saying we're Marxists, we believe in class politics, and they're engaging with people and they're actually doing very well. They're the fourth largest party in the Belgian parliament. They have strongholds among white working class people as well as immigrants. And then you've got a party of the British left hiding the fact that they're Marxist at the bottom of a long list of identity issues. I think it's a sad. I mean, it's just one picture, but I know a lot of people in the party who are not happy with the way it's going either. So it's a sad reflection on the British left, and it's become obsessed with identity to the point where even a Marxist party is not willing to talk about Marxism.
Right. Yeah, and I mean, they might talk about it in the abstract,
Yeah,
but as far as posing the question that whatever issues you're concerned with, it's the working class as a class that can lead the way and resolve it as part of its struggle against the capitalist class.
yeah.
So, and what's your perspectives for the Greens? Do you think that they might break out of the kind of the petty bourgeois layer that you seem to be saying they're mainly involved in?
I don't see it, to be honest. They have put forward. I don't know much about the details of their program, but they have put forward some ideas about things like raising the minimum wage and improving union rights. So they do seem to be interested in trying to tap in to the working class vote, at least the organised working class vote, trying to attract trade unionists. But they, they, these are sort of side issues for them, it appears to me anyway. They're very focused on identity. Um, and I don't see them becoming the kind of party that the working class needs. I think they're more interested in taking that the graduate urban vote away from Labour. I think that's where the focus is. And also they're doing very well in tapping into the immigrant working class vote, but the broader working class vote, they don't seem to be at this point anyway particularly interested in. But then, to be fair, this it is a small party that's trying to build itself up. So perhaps they're thinking, well, we'll go after this constituency and then we'll maybe target that constituency. Um, they've been they've been around a long time, the Greens, but they've only recently started to build up into a serious force. So their breakthrough hasn't been like reforms; it's been a very slow, gradual thing that's that suddenly seemed to have built momentum under its new leader, Zach Polanski. Whereas reform is literally 4 years old, reform, and it's outdone everyone in these
Well,
most recent elections.
you know, the other part is working class politics and a working class party. Yes, it has to run people in elections, but it's our politics are not just confined to elections.
Yeah,
And it's also involved in organizing and building campaigns out in the street and
yeah.
workers' struggles on the workplace and so on.
Mm.
So,
So I think to be fair to the Greens, I think they are good at local campaigns. I I don't think they're at this point interested all that much in getting involved in union politics. But in terms of local campaigning, they are good, and I think they've always been good. I don't think that's a recent development for them. I think they've always been good at, especially campaigning around local environmental issues. But under Polanski, they've started to broaden out into more social justice areas.
and another question is how much does I know Britain is no longer in the EU, but how much do events in Western Europe and also in Eastern Europe, how much does that impact into British politics and into consciousness, including the whole issue of the role of Russia and the war in Ukraine and so on?
Um, it does have an impact because Britain does a lot of trade with the European Union, and also because we were in the European Union for a long time, we are very much aligned with the European Union in terms of things like workers' rights, uh, safety at work, food standards, all those kind of things. Because we're trading with them so much, I don't see that changing too much in the near future, especially things like food standards. Because if we're selling them food and they're selling us food, the standards have to be the same. Um, and when it comes to wider issues, um, immigration again is something where Britain and Britain's position in Europe and in the continent of Europe is important because very few immigrants come directly to Britain. They tend to go to France or Belgium first and then come to Britain. So that's caused arguments between Britain and those countries because under, well, this is the strange thing, under European rules, when people arrive in Europe, they're supposed to make an asylum claim in the first country they arrive in. But because Britain isn't in the EU anymore, um, Britain isn't covered by that rule. So Britain has had to try to make specific treaties or specific deals with other countries. But there's no incentive for France to say to people who have arrived in France, no, you can't go to Britain, you've got to stay here. So it's a weird situation Britain has voted itself into with Brexit. Um, and there's also, I think, a distrust in Europe with Britain when it comes to dealing with issues like that, because I think a lot of Europeans feel that, well, you chose to leave us, so why should we be making deals with you over these things? The one area I think where there's growing cooperation is on Russia, because Britain from the start has been very pro-Ukraine, um, even more so than France or Germany. They've gradually become more and more pro-Ukraine. Macron was very, well, you'll know this, John. Macron was very much in the early days of the war, chatting with Putin and trying to get him to see sense and all that sort of stuff. And he eventually realised, no, this man's just using me. And Germany, well, Germany has only recently started to understand the danger that Russia poses in terms of creating a wider European war. Um, but Britain's been very, very pro-Ukraine from the start. There's certainly a lot of people in Britain who are pro-Russia, and they tend to cluster around reform because Nigel Farage is pro-Russia. But all of the British political parties, other than that, are pro-Ukraine, and the bulk of their supporters seem to be pro-Ukraine as well. Some parties are very pro-Ukraine. The Scottish National Party, for example, is very pro-Ukraine, and the Labour Party, very pro-Ukraine. I think the Conservatives are a little bit split. Maybe there's some on the right who are maybe pro-Russia, but most, I think, Conservatives are also pro-Ukraine. So Britain's been kind of at the forefront in terms of Western Europe. There are Eastern European countries that are much more steadfast and supportive of Ukraine. Poland, for example, Sweden as well.
So yeah. So when it came out that the head of the Welsh reform was actually getting paid by Putin,
yeah,
but from what you were saying, it didn't really hurt reform very much in Wales.
no, no. It's difficult to understand. There doesn't seem to be anything at the moment that can hurt reform, and I think that's because they're in the early phase of this rise, and they're not coming under a lot of scrutiny from the media. Their supporters are very forgiving of things that maybe they wouldn't forgive other people for. In fact, I'll give you an example of that. The former Labour Deputy Prime Minister, Angela Rayner, made a mistake with it. Well, she said she made a mistake with her taxes. I don't know if it was a mistake or if it was intentional, but she underpaid a property tax. I think it was £40,000, and she was forced to stand down as Deputy Prime Minister. A lot of damage has been done to her reputation. It might take years for her to recover from that. Whereas Nigel Farage was gifted £5 million from a cryptocurrency billionaire. And as soon as he got that money, he suddenly became the biggest cheerleader for cryptocurrency. It didn't damage him at all. He's not being asked hard questions about it. His supporters don't seem to mind about it, even though they would bring up the Angela Rayner £40,000 tax bill. At the moment, nothing seems to stick to that party. It's
Yeah.
it's irritating, but it can't last forever. I mean, the media are beginning to ask them tougher questions and be a little more forensic when dealing with them, but they're still getting an easy ride, I think.
Just completely aside from the media, Trump famously said in 2016 that he could shoot somebody in the middle of Fifth Avenue and he wouldn't lose any support. So what you're saying, it sounds like there's a similar mentality. I mean, every day some news comes out about some corruption or something that Trump was involved in, and he doesn't lose support. Even with the Iran war, amongst his base, he's lost support amongst the independent voters. But within his base, he hasn't lost support with that, and including, with the rise in prices and so on.
Yeah, it's very similar. There was a dip in reforms support. So a few months ago, they were at around 28 or 29%. But coming into the election, that had dropped to around maybe 21, 21, depending on which poll. And I know people on the left who got quite excited about that because the Greens were rising in the polls as well, and they seemed to think there was a switch from the Greens from Reform over to the Greens, but that wasn't really happening. What was happening was there was a split in Reform, and a guy called Rupert Lowe created a party called Restore, who are even further to the right. I don't think Restore stood in these council elections because they're a very new party. Or if they did, they only stood a few people. But they were at one point getting 10% of the in the polls. They were at
Further to
around
the right.
10%.
They were
Sorry?
further to the right from reform.
Yeah, further, yeah. So it seemed that what was happening was that this dip in reform support was actually going to Rupert Lowe's party. And reform in England, I think they got about 25% of the vote. So it seems that they've pulled back some of that support from Restore. As I say, I'm not sure that Restore even stood any candidates in this election. So maybe the Restore supporters just voted for Reform because it was the closest thing to their party. But yeah, Restore are worrying because they are it's difficult to believe, but they're much worse than Reform.
Yeah. So would you say that they are, excuse me, an outright fascist party?
No, I wouldn't go that far. I think there are certainly fascists in it. I wouldn't be surprised to find there are lots of fascists in it, and there are known fascists in Reform as well. But whenever any of these people in Reform say outrageous things, they tend to get disciplined in some way. There were several council election candidates who were forced to withdraw their candidacy. Um, a few people have been kicked out of the party. I think those people would probably be much more comfortable in Restore. I don't think they would be kicked out of Restore. So
For instance,
it's
Tommy Robinson, where would he fall?
he would be further to the right even than Restore.
Okay. So I have another question as far as Scotland. I think you
Yeah.
said that the Scottish National Party, the SNP, was kind of tending to take more of an anti-immigrant stance now. Is is that correct?
No, no. I'm trying to remember what I was saying about the SNP, but no,
Well,
they're not.
so
They're
how
not
do you
taking it.
see how do you see their role as far as the issue of immigration and so on?
The SNP are quite positive about immigration, but they don't have any say over it. The SNP council in my city, Glasgow, uh, turned Glasgow into the British equivalent of a sanctuary city for migrants. So about one third of all asylum seekers in the UK now live in Glasgow. Um, but that in itself is now up. This is where maybe there's a issue with the SNP because I think the plan there was when Glasgow City Council did that, they thought other SNP councils will do the same as we are doing, and maybe some Labour ones down in England will do it, but no one else did. So that's why Glasgow, which is not a particularly huge city, is about 800,000 people in Glasgow. It has one third of the asylum seekers from the whole of the UK. So the SNP leadership in Glasgow have hinted that maybe they will have to end that policy. But that's really the only. They're not an anti-migrant party. They're very pro immigration, but they've got no real say on the national policy.
What I'm thinking about, so to what extent, if at all, is politics in Ireland connected with or played out with politics in Scotland?
Well, there's a big um, Irish migrant community in Scotland, although most of them are a bit like me. They've got grandparents or great grandparents who were Irish rather than there being that there are Irish people in Scotland, but there's not a huge number. Um, but the politics of the west of Scotland, especially, is tied to Ireland. S- Scotland likes to present itself as a very progressive modern country, but in one respect, that's not true, and that is that Scotland is it has anti-Catholic bigotry um, practically woven into the fabric of the country. Um, there's an organisation called the Orange Order who march through the streets of Glasgow every year, and various other parts of the west of Scotland, and they are rabidly and openly anti-Catholic and especially anti-Irish Catholic. So what happens in Ireland does have an impact here, but it's a kind of it's strange to try to understand it because I've met people who are very welcoming of of immigrants from everywhere in the world, but they don't like Catholics and they don't like Irish Catholics especially.
right?
I'm not saying that that's common, but it's a thing, and it's almost like a kind of a second tier of Scottish politics. It's just below the surface. This feeling of are people judging me because I have an Irish name? Are people judging me because I have a Catholic background? And I'm sure there are Protestants who have conversations with people who are overtly Catholic, thinking, "I wonder if this person hates me because I'm a Protestant." Um, it's it's and you don't even see it to any great extent in the rest of mainland Britain. You see it in Northern Ireland, obviously, but in the rest of mainland Britain, I don't think many people could care less if you're Catholic or Protestant. I don't think it matters to them. Even when people are bigoted in other ways in England, I don't think they really care about the Catholic and Protestant thing to any great extent. Whereas in Scotland, it seems to be the one form of bigotry that that people can be quite open about. As I said, there are hundreds of marches against Catholics in Scotland every year.
Mm.
Um, they try to dress it up as a cultural thing, we're commemorating the Battle of the Boyne in the 17th century, that sort of thing. But it's very clearly and obviously directed against Catholics. The Orange Order insist on marching past Catholic churches every time they march, even if there are services on. Worshippers coming out of churches have been abused and spat on just very recently, just within the last couple of years, that's happened. So that kind of bigotry is still very much alive in Scotland. And it strikes me a very strange thing because I mean, Scotland is very welcoming of people from all over the world, and yet this one form of bigotry just seems to cling on and have a life of its own. It's very strange.
That's interesting. And how about the issue of Israel and Palestine and so on? How much has that impacted British politics?
Well, that's another reason why I think that Labour are losing support to the Greens because although Labour they've kind of sat on the fence to some extent with in terms of helping the US and Iran or Israel in its recent campaign in Palestine. They've stopped the sale of some weapons or components, but they've allowed the sale of others to Israel. They've been heavily criticised by the left for that. They've been criticised from the right for not just allowing Israel to have whatever they want. But there's a campaign group called Palestine Action, and not only have they found themselves in a lot of trouble, but they've actually found themselves designated as a terrorist organisation. So they believe in direct action, but it's peaceful direct action. They haven't bombed anyone or shot anyone, but they did break into a plant owned by a weapons company that was selling weapons to Israel, and they did a lot of damage. Instead of just being charged with criminal damage, they were charged with offences the under terrorism laws. So that resulted in the whole organisation being designated a terrorist organisation, and literally hundreds of people have been arrested for not for being part of that organisation, but for protesting in support of that organisation and protesting to have people from that organisation released from jail. So they've lost. So remember earlier I was talking about the kind of maybe middle class graduate leftists who have been moving to the Green Party. Well, that is one of the reasons they've been moving to the Green Party because the Greens are much more pro-Palestine.
And how about in broader society?
I think there's actually a lot of support for Palestine broadly in the UK. Um, yeah, and I guess it probably cuts across party lines to some extent as well. A lot of Labour people are pro-Palestine. It's the leadership that isn't. Um, the Scottish National Party is pretty broadly and firmly pro-Palestine. Um, I guess it's probably the same with the Welsh nationalists. Um, and the left in general in the UK is pro-Palestine, but even people in the centre and maybe even some people on the right have at least got some sympathy with Palestine. They might not describe themselves as pro-Palestine, but they might have some sympathy with them. I certainly think that pro-Palestinians outnumber quite comfortably um, people who are pro-Israel, although there are plenty of Zionists or pro-Zionist people
Yeah.
supportive of Israel, but I think the pro-Palestine side, if it was down to a head count, the pro-Palestine side would win. It's just that we've had successive governments that are quite close to, in fact, very close to Israel. Some of their funding seems to come from Israel for both the Labour Party and the Conservative Party.
Yeah, it's similar here. I mean, even just amongst like a wide layer of the working class, just, I mean, they've just not been able to keep a secret from workers and people in general about the crimes that Israel is committing. And I think a lot of people are just being turned off to that. I think also that, as we know, anybody that's anti-Zionist is labeled anti-Semite. So
Yeah,
just complete, but there is genuine anti-Semitism.
yeah,
And it's a lot more widespread here than a lot of people think it is or are aware of.
yeah,
And it has reinforced that anti Semitism because the message here has always been that Israel and Jewish people are one and the same.
mm,
So, therefore, whatever Israel does, that's what Jewish people are.
yeah,
I mean,
yeah,
it's the conception, or the
yeah,
perception.
yeah. Unfortunately, I've encountered a lot of people on the left recently because there's been a spate of anti-Semitic attacks in the UK, especially in London, and I've encountered a lot of people who are they might not be revolutionary socialists, but they are definitely progressive in all of their political positions. And then it comes to anti-Semitic attacks in London, and suddenly they're conspiracy theorists convinced that every one of these attacks is a Mossad false flag operation. It saddens me really because as I said, on virtually every other issue, these are decent people who are progressive, and then it comes to this one thing, and it's like they're open to any weird anti-Semitic conspiracy theory. They'll jump on it. It's sad. I think it shows a lack of leadership from left wing organisations though, because I don't think they've been strong enough in condemning attacks and pointing out that Jewish and Israeli these are two different things, and that if you're angry with Israel, that doesn't justify going to a Jewish neighborhood in London and attacking someone.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I do think that, like, the left of the Labor Party, has been kind of failing in that also.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I guess my last question is this. In my view, the general trend in world politics is towards reaction and counter revolution. And there's been a few steps in the other direction. For instance, Viktor Orban being voted out of office.
Yeah.
But that's almost like the exception
Mm.
to the general trend. So, to what extent would you see the results of this election in Britain as being part of a general trend rather than a particular event?
I definitely think it's part of that trend. As I said, there are people in the UK who will call Farage and Reform fascists, but they're not fascists. They are they're hard right, but it's part of that same trend of right wing populism. Um, and unfortunately, I mentioned the other party, Restore. As I say, they're even further to the right, and 1 in 10 people in England, maybe not in Scotland or Wales, but 1 in 10 people in England seem to be supportive of Restore. So I think the UK's trajectory, it could be even worse. We could end up with Nigel Farage struggling to try to keep up with these people even further to his right. I think what the Green surge shows, though, is that there's at least some attempt, and the Greens are far from perfect. As I said, they're basically it's basically identity politics with the Greens, but there's at least some encouraging sign that there's some life on the left to try and oppose this. But yeah, I do agree that reform is part of that global trend.
So I guess maybe last question is for yourself, what steps do you advocate or what path forward do you see?
I think the left has to re-embrace class politics rather than obviously identity is important to people, and I'm not suggesting that people should drop identity related issues, but if we focus on class, then we bridge divides and we create, well, first of all, the working class is huge. So we create a much bigger force to counter the right. Um, I mentioned the Belgian Workers' Party before, and their leader talking about this, and he said that the phrase he used was when asked about working class people who are racist or might be voting for a racist party or a fascist party, he said the working class is ours, every part of it. That's a verbatim quote. That's how they see it. So the left that I encounter on a daily basis in the UK, they're so ready to write off working class people who have voted for reform. If we had the Belgian attitude, we'd be saying, why are these people voting for reform and how can we win them back? And I think the way to win them back is class politics.
All right. Well, on that's an appropriate note to end on. So thanks very much, Sean. And I hope we'll stay in touch.
Thanks, John.